Remain in the studio. I go live at once and the platform immediately pops up with, "Would you like to leave?" I respond, "No, I don't." Not the most encouraging beginning. My camera won't focus. There, now it's working. Snorts, right. Greetings to everyone. We should now be live. If you are able to hear us, please let us know. Communicate loudly and clearly in the chat. I hope you're all well this Sunday evening or possibly morning or midday depending on your location. Justin, how are you? I am doing fine. The weather has been extremely cold here. Yesterday the temperature dropped to -22 Celsius. That's rather frigid for November. It's not unthinkable, but having experienced milder Novembers recently, it was quite tough yesterday. Laughter. For anyone curious about Justin's remote location, it's known as Canada. Laughter. Greater than that's where. Greater than does the UK experience those temperatures regularly or ever? In the north, yes. In Scotland, it does drop below 0 Celsius. Greater than but what we've noticed is a long summer, rather mild until, I think, late October, and then suddenly between the end of October and now, the temperature fell sharply. As I say this, we just had around 10 degrees this weekend and sunshine on this Sunday, but it has been extremely cold for the past few days. Cold at least by continental Europe and UK standards, so just around freezing, but not actually below. Edward is in the chat and mentions the audio and video are good. Hopefully that remains. Last week, or rather, 2 weeks ago during my last stream, my connection kept dropping, while Justin's was stable. It happened again while setting up today, so perhaps we'll stay connected now that we're live, but no promises given British internet. Now Justin, what kind of Airpower reading have you been doing, or since our previous stream, which, let me check, was 3 weeks past? We've actually increased the frequency of these streams. Greater than yes. We're aiming for one a month and hope to maintain that schedule. So, likely the next one lands in the middle of the holiday period. As for my readings, I haven't delved into anything specific because of certain reasons. It's a classified subject connected to Airpower, which I find exciting. In fact, I have been asked to examine a book manuscript due for publication in the coming months, a project I've followed for years, and the authors contacted me to review it. Chris might read parts as well. I won't disclose more since the manuscript isn't published, but it's an excellent project. My next reading will likely be Richard Dunn's South Pacific Air War, which is intimidating, and I will explain why. Greater than is it a large book? Greater than yes. I inadvertently triggered some responses with my post about it on Blue Sky when I first got it, mentioning its sheer size. Greater than yes. Greater than people teased me for it, but it's enormous. The camera doesn't do it justice, and its print size isn't particularly large or small. Greater than that looks dense. Greater than the book covers the period from January 1943 to February 1944, the least examined phase of the South Pacific Air War. Only a year, and it totals roughly 600 pages including notes. This will take me some time to finish, though viewers might recognize Richard Dunn as the author of Exploding Fuel Tanks, a reference we use often. Yes, clear's throat. That book's renowned for its insights on aircraft fuel tanks that ignite. Greater than I believe that's still the only substantial published work on aircraft protection during World War II. Greater than I can't think of another one. There are other works offering a broader overview on how protection developed across aircraft types, but regarding protected fuel tanks, their function, armor and so forth, this is the sole book I am aware of. Academic articles may exist, yet I doubt that topic fits the focus of most scholarly outlets. Still, the South Pacific Air War volume looks quite compelling. That actually connects with my next point. We discussed previously on our last stream the importance of reviewing the Philippines in a future episode, particularly in relation to its significance, or lack thereof, for the Pacific War, especially during the early Japanese advances along the island chain and MacArthur's subsequent decision to intervene, which touches upon several controversial questions. What role does the Army have in the Pacific theater? That whole debate. We'll tackle it in the future. Or would you rather get into it now preliminarily? Greater than, size. I believe I mentioned several of my impromptu opinions on this a couple of streams ago. The Philippines stand out during the early phase of the conflict, as the available forces there were sizable. A lot of discourse on the initial period highlights the generally weak state of Allied air power and various difficulties, yet the Philippines arguably held the largest concentration of that power. Greater than, and they received fairly adequate warning that hostilities were imminent. Of course, there's an ongoing controversy about why those warnings weren't acted upon. There's the well-known B-17 dilemma. The airfields in Taiwan were cloaked in rain, frustrating operations for the Japanese, who worried about being bombed first. Sometimes the debate amuses me. It's as if Schrödinger's clouds apply. The weather is too severe for takeoff, yet somehow B-17s would still bomb through that cloud cover with precision. It would have been preferable to strike first, but whether it would have truly mattered is very debatable. When it comes to the later reinvasion of the Philippines, greater than a recent article explored the origins of the kamikaze and its links to that period. The piece, by Nick Capper, a historian specializing in Japanese history, draws on extensive Japanese archival sources and questions aspects of the established narrative on kamikaze, such as who devised the concept. It may not have been a spontaneous field development by Onishi Takajiro. Higher naval leadership likely considered it earlier, then delivered instructions to Onishi to implement it in the Philippines. Quite a different interpretation. The article also addresses why this occurred, notably the fact that Onishi died by suicide, probably on August 16, directly after the surrender. Thus, he provides a convenient scapegoat upon whom all responsibility is placed, while numerous top leaders who survived World War II and the post-war years may have played important roles. The Philippine Campaign, both in 1941-42 and again in 1944-45, is full of material for analysis. We'll need to devote serious research time to it. Greater than certainly, we'll tackle that topic as it represents a significant case study for examining air power, including some naval matters as required, perhaps even some analysis of Army operations. That theater is profoundly shaped by air operations. There are plenty of lessons to draw from it. Additionally, as World War II analysts pointed out, it's inexplicable considering the U.S. Navy's stance that the Philippines wasn't defensible. The two services appeared to lack any mutual understanding of each other's strategy. At the outbreak of hostilities in the Pacific, this wasn't just an American issue. The British had similar problems, such as the disconnect between the RAF and Army in Malaya. They held very different expectations for defense, transition to war, and operational conduct during combat. There simply hadn't been any forcing mechanism to consolidate inter-branch planning. When they did attempt cooperation, huge barriers arose. Not all of them military. Civilians in the colonies often believed themselves apart from conflicts in China or Europe and were reluctant for military disruption of normal life. Popham regularly encountered this in Singapore when trying to prepare the area's forces for a potential Japanese offensive. Yes, it's notable. We also agreed to conduct a dedicated stream on the Malaya campaign in the future, correct? Greater than yes, at some point. Yes, it has been delayed, but it's on the agenda. Laughter. Greater than our optimistic November timeline slipped. Now it's the 30th and still not scheduled. But we do intend to cover it. Regarding U.S. weather information on Japanese airfields. Greater than oh yes, my remarks relate more to historiography. The Japanese were very concerned about a delay resulting in preemptive bombing of their positions, and some works contend that, had the B-17s bombed through the weather, the outcome would have been dire. Achieving accurate strikes in minimal visibility is sometimes possible, but the major element being overlooked is the weather itself, which shaped events significantly. In short, it would have been preferable for B-17s to be airborne rather than on the ground when Japanese forces eventually arrived. There is a significant debate around this topic. A comprehensive book exists covering simply December 8th in the Philippines greater than I believe it's called December 8th, or MacArthur's Pearl Harbor, or something along those lines. I own several books by William Barch, that author, and should read the one dedicated entirely to that day, as it's substantial and probes the various aspects of accountability, blame, uncertainty, and numerous related factors. That has been the bulk of my recent reading. How about you, Chris? Greater than I've been studying a lot that's only slightly relevant to the channel. It is tangentially related, but you know about all of that. I am still researching Soviet doctrines for air assault and paratrooper operations, which is quite fascinating because in the 1930s, before the purges removed or executed much of the leadership, Soviet theorists experimented with reintegrating mobility into their forces. After World War II, the prevailing lesson was that defense beats offense, right? However, as Glantz pointed out in one of his numerous works, the lengthy Russian Civil War had a lasting effect. While we often consider it as ending around 1917–1918, the war persisted for much longer. During this time, irregular unit formation and reliance on relatively poorly equipped infantry dominated battle tactics, making force maneuvers and positional advantage essential. This pushed Soviet planners to conceive methods for deploying large formations, eventually division or corps-size formations behind enemy lines to cause significant disruption. Studying documents from the early 1930s reveals experimentation with new formations, aiming to create as many as 4 airborne brigades, but they barely managed to field one, which only reached 200 personnel, not truly a brigade. Even so, they set clear objectives. In the future, I'll likely create a video topic on this, as it's quite engrossing. Early on, they conducted about 500 exercises with paratroopers in a year, testing everything from optimal drop altitude to what weapons troops should carry. Most received only pistols, which seems telling about their resources at the time. So that's ongoing. I'm also planning to release more videos about the Netherlands. My last video covered German operations against the Dutch, and at some point later in this stream, I may elaborate on that, especially regarding Germany's bombing of Rotterdam, executed because the Germans, under pressure to secure a surrender, bombed the city to force capitulation. This is interesting since the standard story about Rotterdam being bombed by mistake is incorrect. Such a concentrated attack cannot happen by accident. Even though the bombardment order tried to cancel the raid, that does not alter the fact that they intended to bomb Rotterdam. Such a topic is likely to spark debate. So, I've kept busy, much of it unrelated to the channel, and continue work on my book. Finding time has been challenging, but overall, prospects for 2026 look good. Greater than we've received a request for English or Swedish interwar, WWII aviation introductory books. Greater than yes. I'll start with some suggestions, then perhaps you can recommend one for the Pacific. Greater than well, it depends on your focus. If you want to study aircraft types, there are numerous books, some no longer in print but still obtainable through second-hand sources that detail, for example, all British bombers from a specific era, often with in-depth breakdowns. If you're drawn to strategic concepts, the United States Naval Institute Press carries several important works, such as those on the origins of American strategic bombing theory. They often have seasonal or military discounts. Craig Morris's book, for example, is useful, and when it comes to World War II Airpower, I always recommend Tammy Biddle's Rhetoric and Reality in Airpower During the Second World War. It tracks initial expectations for airpower in strategy and what it actually achieved, serving as a robust entry-level read for anyone wanting to delve into the conceptual rather than purely technical or individual aspects of air power. Lastly, the best advice is to read based on your own interests, rather than because a source is deemed must-read. Even though I just advocated for Biddle's book as essential, start with what grabs your attention. If you are drawn to a specific plane, even an Osprey book can provide a springboard to deeper research, letting you discover your true interest, be it technology, personalities, operations, or doctrine. I believe Justin agrees we're more interested in how technology impacts the operational level, rather than focusing solely on technical minutiae such as ammunition or armor thickness, which isn't so important at the operational or strategic level. It occasionally matters in combat, but not much beyond that. Greater than yes, I am of like mind. I've spent years developing a solid technical foundation, so I am comfortable discussing it, as you are. But some in the audience are even more technically inclined, particularly in our Discord, where people pick up on small technical details that amaze me. I study technical topics to contextualize broader air power questions. My main research area remains American intelligence assessments of Japanese air and naval power. To distinguish myself from other formidable scholars working in the same field, I focus on deeply understanding the Asia-Pacific air and naval war and its technology so I can analyze what American intelligence was assessing. I feel a limitation of some scholarship, not to diminish the quality, is that intelligence historians can lack immersion in Asia-Pacific or Chinese history or the backstory of Japanese air power. As a result, they sometimes leave unexplored gaps that I seek to address. That's where my work began, and personal interest certainly helps. Laughter. In addition, as far as a recommendation goes, you covered many excellent sources already, but for anyone studying Japanese aviation development, Wings for the Rising Sun is outstanding. It is a comprehensive developmental history spanning from the 19th century to 1945, including a short section on the post-war era, covering mostly interwar and World War II years. The book lightly discusses conceptual air power theory but focuses on technical history and development, and I strongly recommend it. Another book this time specifically about the Japanese Navy is Sunburst, by Mark Peaty, which deals only with the interwar years, with a concluding chapter about aspects of the Asia-Pacific War. It's very detailed, especially for the Navy. Unfortunately, nothing similar covers the Army, but the Navy side is well represented, and as far as I know, it remains in print. Greater than such books are valuable because they clarify how each Air Force was shaped by the needs and strategies of its nation, correcting simplistic views that victors always had better equipment. Each country developed air arms to serve national doctrine and goals, meaning German, British, Japanese, American, and even Canadian Air Forces diverged in design and function, shaped by their resources, practices, and war plans. For Luftwaffe history, Arming the Luftwaffe offers a strong foundation, and Quorum's The Creation of the Operational Air War is also excellent. Two books on the Luftwaffe examine its war crimes and industrial base, including one by Adam Tooze, who, as an economist, provides distinctive insights. Wings of the Rising Sun is by Jürgen Melzer. Greater than yes, Jürgen Melzer. He's German, so I may mispronounce the name. Greater than no, you pronounce it well. Those are my recommendations. By the way, approaching research professionally and selecting a unique niche is vital, particularly in popular fields. For Luftwaffe studies, not many historians are working today. Perhaps 5 come to mind for me, for various reasons. That allows broader exploration in Luftwaffe research, possibly leading to a comprehensive work in the future. Next year, for those watching, look out for a book on close air support, plus the recently translated Panzer Conference Articles Compendium, due for English publication in Q1, which will include my chapter on close air support structures. Alvin asks if Sweden should collaborate on F-45 or try to get the Gripen E for Canada as a way to showcase that platform. As a Swede, the Gripen appeals, and it's a remarkable aircraft. For those unaware, my main channel now focuses on World War II, but I have a secondary one Airpower 21st century where, starting next year, I'll upload on modern aviation subjects. As for the Canada debate, it's not about capabilities right now but about domestic politics. That's the essential context, in my view. But I'll defer to a Canadian on this topic. Laughter. Greater than yes. I am far from an authority on Canadian procurement, just a Canadian with moderate awareness. No, in fact, that makes you an expert. If you live there, you know everything about it. Greater than everything, yes. Take my words momentously. Greater than unofficial, laughter, information. It's embedded in my psyche. Laughter, gasps. Greater than the procurement saga has, by now, stretched back decades, at least about 20 years. Greater than around 2 decades, yes. Greater than this is a recurring issue. There's even a book that details the long process Canada went through acquiring the Leopard 1 battle tank in the 1970s. Lengthy Canadian procurement processes are not new, they're hampered by countless variables. A key aspect is that many Canadians are not especially mindful of national defense. For decades, because of geography, the public hasn't had to consider it. When governments need to cut spending, defense is usually among the first affected due to lack of public concern. Procurement debates usually reduce to superficial price tag comparisons, inciting outrage at perceived waste on military hardware. That thinking has shifted of late due to recent world events and U.S. relations, bringing greater emphasis on military spending, something unfamiliar throughout my life. Born at the conclusion of the Cold War, all I've known is continual cuts and neglect of defense. Watching the sudden increase in military funding is quite odd. Regarding the F-35 versus Gripen question, recent CBC coverage showed the 2021 competition report, which indicates that the F-35 far outpaced the competition in all key capabilities. But, as Chris noted, the issue now goes beyond performance. The central concern is the reliability of the United States as a partner. There is also a widespread assumption among the public that the F-35 is much more expensive, though that's debatable, especially once you consider mixed fleet operational costs. The reason for considering a mixed fleet is primarily that, to some degree, this is already the direction we are headed in. I am not certain of the exact figure, but a small number of F-35s have been scheduled for delivery. Therefore, the debate concerns whether to maintain a mixed fleet or transition entirely to the F-35 model. I genuinely understand the rationale supporting each approach. This isn't an instance of deliberately avoiding a firm stance out of indecisiveness. It is a matter of recognizing the validity of both viewpoints. The outcome, as determined by government decision, will be noteworthy. Given the length of this process, it no longer falls under the jurisdiction of a single political party. In Canada, control alternates federally between the Liberals and Conservatives every 5 or 10 years. Both parties have been involved in the process, each reversing its stance at different times, which means there is no clear resolution in sight. Furthermore, although I do not know the precise timeframe, we are rapidly approaching the point at which the CF-18s will reach the end of their operational life. We are getting to a stage where those aircraft will soon be unable to fly, so a decision must be made before long. The matter has been delayed as much as possible. In fact, related to this topic of continued postponement, I once interviewed a Canadian expert on my channel who specializes profoundly in modern air power. Richard Chimica from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, assuming he is still affiliated there. I am about to add a link to that discussion in the chat. Please note, this is an older conversation and does not include developments from the most recent deliberations. The video runs for about an hour and offers a comprehensive review of how Canada previously arrived at the F-35 selection, not this current round or any changes that may occur. The future remains uncertain. For anyone interested but unfamiliar with the more intricate background of the F-35 program and Canada's involvement, which was initially quite strong, this interview provides a useful analysis and a perspective on the matter. Of course, independent research and drawing your own conclusions remains important. The situation itself is highly complex. Personally, even as I consider it now, I am aware that my own knowledge only scratches the surface, especially as, at the end of the day, Canadian aircraft procurement is not among my highest priorities, though the implications for the alliance are generally relevant. My more immediate focus is on European developments, but that is my own preference. This echoes the historical pattern of neglecting military concerns until circumstances become pressing. Currently, there are certain similarities to earlier periods. My studies suggest that as the interwar era progressed, Countries increasingly recognized the need for rearmament and raised expenditures accordingly, but were hampered initially by limitations in workforce, industrial capability, available resources, and similar bottlenecks. Governments also faced choices regarding the allocation of valuable materials such as metals and timber and navigating the balance between strengthening their military sector and maintaining economic prosperity. Pushing too hard into defense during peacetime risks distorting the economy, which seems obvious with hindsight only after a conflict has begun. Overcommitting to military production before any clear threat could leave a nation lagging in broader economic competition. Achieving balance is crucial. A solid foundational military infrastructure should be maintained, rather than consistently being sacrificed in budgetary decisions. Since the so-called peace dividend, infrastructure has been gradually rebuilt, and this renewed emphasis is projected to show substantial returns by the 2030s, though the situation remains challenging at present. With the conversation moving toward modern developments, which is not the immediate aim for this channel's subject matter, we will set that aside for now. There is a long-standing tendency to blame Chamberlain unfairly, despite his role in accelerating rearmament, particularly for the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy, after Munich. Chamberlain is a figure I have only encountered in limited detail, but I note that his administration in its later phase made more positive strides than in its initial years. The hypothetical of how things might have played out under alternative leadership ventures into speculative territory, which we try to avoid. Justin, as a representative of the Commonwealth, do you have thoughts? I am not deeply versed in the full literature, yet I am aware that historians have adopted a more nuanced view of Chamberlain's record on rearmament than is reflected in popular opinion. While he's become synonymous with the idea of appeasement, scholarly perspectives now credit him with laying groundwork for British rearmament. This reassessment has largely emerged over the past 2 decades or so. In Britain, cultural memory of the Second World War emphasizes figures like Churchill, often at the expense of previous governments' reputations, though the academic discourse has shifted. Typically, academic understanding updates 5 to 10 years before the majority of new popular histories, and broadcast documentaries may lag even further. By the time corrections reach mass audiences, the next developments may already be underway. There are also questions about flight simulation and air combat tactics. For instance, the impact of flight simulators like War Thunder or DCS World on popular understanding of energy fighting in dogfights is notable. I have observed that, generally, the increased accessibility of aviation games has had a positive effect. Companies like Gaijin and Wargaming fund independent research that sometimes uncovers new details about tanks, ships, and aircraft. This increased visibility inspires many, including myself. I first became interested in aviation history after encountering documentaries of questionable factual quality. Games can serve a similar purpose. Regarding concepts like energy fighting, I suspect the average War Thunder player now has a better grasp of those dynamics than many Second World War pilots, simply because the scientific understanding at the time was less complete. For example, though the Royal Air Force did analyze energy and maneuver performance in 1940, real-life decisions often depended on instinct or incomplete data. In-game mechanics force players into encounters that real pilots might avoid. Joe Foss, for example, would deliberately withdraw rather than fight a zero in equivalent circumstances. In games, however, objectives push participants into combat regardless. Historically, hit-and-run tactics in the South Pacific meant a single pass through enemy formations, followed by immediate withdrawal, quite unlike the repeat engagements often expected in simulations. Game structures encourage a distorted experience of risk and engagement. In reality, pilots seldom sought unnecessary fights. The historical record shows that gunnery, perception, and disengagement were integral disciplines. Video games are also a tremendous catalyst for building interest in military history. Museums have observed increases in participation, especially from younger demographics, thanks to games like World of Tanks driving interest in tanks. Aircraft have not seen the same impact, partly because aerial combat remains more nuanced and complex. Even so, Simulators like DCS or IL-2 offer levels of immersion and knowledge unavailable in previous generations, but this does not directly map to real-life combat, where variables like stress and risk are decisive factors. Additionally, in simulators, players are often more accurate in gunnery due to the nature of game physics, even if they lack the experience of real pilots. Matches in games can create inflated expectations. More aircraft may be destroyed virtually in a few hours than would be seen for days on real front lines. Often, players in simulators behave in ways more informed by perceived history than actual combat records, such as replicating high-altitude tactics on the Eastern Front when most dogfights historically occurred much lower. The intersection between gaming and historical perception thus creates both positive engagement and misconceptions. For aviation museums, this influx of interest from younger participants is a welcome development, as previous generations of core enthusiasts have begun to decline. Even if this means exhibitions are more visually oriented, increasing accessibility is a net gain if it means more people engage with history. For example, most people have played War Thunder but not experienced air combat in reality. Discussions with real Air Force pilots who use DCS suggest that some aspects translate well to real flying, while others do not at all. Notably, in 95% of situations where I get shot down in War Thunder, it is by enemies I did not see even with game aids like red tags and markers. Historically, pilots frequently reported being attacked by unseen adversaries, which is confirmed by memoirs like Wing Leader by Johnson. While some pilots articulated awareness of attacks, in most cases, the victims offered little to no defensive response, supporting the notion that situational awareness is much lower in real combat than in gaming. Moving to a new topic. There was a question regarding evidence for the United States Navy's advantage in deflection shooting compared to other air services. John Lundstrom, in his first team series, argues that the U.S. Navy alone formally trained pilots in deflection shooting prior to the war, though both the Navy and Japanese forces emphasized this skill to an extent. According to Lundstrom's detailed accounts, U.S. Navy pilots flying Wildcats excelled in high-angle deflection shots, while the Japanese Navy's preparation was somewhat less rigorous in this respect. Regarding the U.S. Army or Japanese Army, there is insufficient information to draw a direct comparison. If present, sources are not as comprehensive as Lundstrom's accounts. Turning to the RAF, available gunnery manuals indicate some focus on training for deflection shooting, but equivalent in-depth documentation for the Luftwaffe has not emerged, nor have detailed curricula from their training schools. Evidence suggests all air forces used target towing as a basic gunnery practice, and in the U.S. Army Air Force, gunnery training expanded significantly during World War II. Still, average skill levels remained relatively modest. A select few, such as Hans Marseille for Germany and certain British aces, including one who notably achieved many kills with extreme deflection shots, stood out, though many successful pilots were somewhat eccentric and difficult individuals. Unfortunately, I cannot recall his name, but it may come to me, or perhaps someone in the chat remembers. Finally, as a programming note for the stream, Justin and I are open to audience feedback and plan to explore individual historical topics in detail in future sessions. For instance, I now intend to provide an overview of Operation Festung, or Unanum, the German air landing operation against the Netherlands in 1940, as a supplement to recent videos. I will share my screen for this walkthrough using Google Maps. Be aware that the current borders are from 2025 and do not precisely match those of 1940, but are generally similar. The discussion will cover the German operations designed to neutralize the Netherlands by targeting Fortress Holland as Germany's western offensive began. Fortress Holland essentially refers to the region south of Rotterdam within the deeper interior of Holland. Then tracing along the rivers toward roughly my knowledge of geography is faltering here to the Mameer area. Thus, Fortress Holland comprises numerous airfields. There are approximately 3 to 4 airfields surrounding the H2 or located around Rotterdam. A further airfield, including Schiphol near Amsterdam, is present. Several more airfields can be found in this area, which the Germans, and notably the Luftwaffe, viewed with concern as possible bases for RAF operations in any forthcoming conflict. Consequently, they aimed to prevent Britain from using these locations and, by extension, deny British troops a route through here, thus safeguarding the Ruhr and northern Germany. The Ruhr, of course, being the region vital to German industrial production and the source of much raw material extraction. As previously shown in another video, even though Germany seized and held the Netherlands for much of the war, up until around 1944 and, in some northern regions, 1945, the ongoing occupation meant Britain and the United States could launch direct attacks on Germany without the complication of Dutch neutrality. Turning now to F. The Dutch side saw an air landing operation featuring the Septifiger Division, numbering around 4,500 troops in 2 regiments, the Fallschirmjäger. Alongside them, the 22nd Air Landing Division contributed about 12,000 men, all allocated primarily for this offensive. It should be noted there were also air landing actions in Belgium, particularly near Maastricht and Liege, where several bridges, including the Ghent Bridge, the Foven Bridge, and another whose name escapes me but is located here, as well as the fortress of Eben Emael, became targets. That topic, however, falls outside this specific operational review. The core German objective for their airborne assault was the seizure of the bridge at the Meuse, then the Doré Bridge, and specifically, this bridge here in Rotterdam. This, though a contemporary map with additional bridges, highlights the critical point in Rotterdam. Securing this would allow the 18th Army and specifically the 9th Panzer Division to move along the axis, cross rivers, and push toward The Hague. Next to these goals, the capture of The Hague and thereby control over the Dutch government and the royal family was prioritized to possibly hold the royal family hostage as well. Achieving this required 3 separate airborne operations around The Hague. One to the south, now urbanized, another to the east, also more developed today, and a third to the northeast, a built-up area at present. This place, called Scheveningen, though as a German speaker I am not supposed to pronounce it correctly, yet I can. Thank you very much. I can state now that this operation around The Hague turned out disastrously for the Germans, resulting in total failure. In contrast, the missions to secure the Rotterdam bridges succeeded but became highly strained by the 3rd day. This is what pushed the Germans to decide on bombing Rotterdam, which will be discussed in greater detail shortly. Most of the Luftwaffe aircraft attacking the Netherlands took off from northern Germany. Focusing now on the bombers, they would head over the North Sea, fly parallel to the coastline as though en route to England, thus misleading Dutch observers, before turning south and making low-level strikes on every airfield within Fortress Holland. Some Dutch positions did spot the German planes